Some people grow flowers out of passion. Others use their shadows to hide a murder. When a renowned botanist was found dead in her own greenhouse, and all the evidence pointed to an innocent young man, no one imagined that the true killer was hiding behind the most ordinary and respected face in town. But Miss Marple has always known, human nature never really changes, and no matter how beautifully a murder is planned, the truth has a way of blooming. It was an unusually golden and almost suspiciously quiet Tuesday afternoon in the heart of May, when Miss Clara Ellsworth arrived at the time-worn iron gates of Greystone Manor, the scent of overripe rhododendrons thick in the air, curling through the hedges like a secret trying to escape. She wore a neatly tailored tweed shawl, and her gloved fingers clutched her old leather knitting pouch like a talisman, her eyes sharper than they let on beneath the soft wisps of white hair. Greystone's faded grey stone loomed before her like a keeper of stories too old and heavy to speak aloud. Clara's pace was brisk despite her age, guided more by instinct than muscle memory, as if some deep part of her knew something was not quite right. Dorothy Langley, her longtime confidant and the spirited mistress of the manor, welcomed her at the doorway with an anxious smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come quickly," she murmured. "There's something strange." Clara's visit, originally meant to be a quiet tea between old friends, swiftly unraveled into something far more unsettling. Inside the drawing room, dust motes floated in sunbeams like watching eyes. Seated stiffly near the fireplace were Mrs. Grimble, widow of the late circuit judge, with a permanent look of outrage etched into her brow, and Miss Thistlethwaite, the timid piano tutor whose hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. The talk, already midstream, turned thick with unease as Miss Thistlethwaite, her voice thin and almost conspiratorial, recounted how her late mother's heirloom ruby ring had vanished from her locked jewelry case. She hadn't even noticed it was gone until she found her cat Leopold, cowering under the stairs, a ribbon of deep crimson thread tied precisely around his neck, and one ear seared as if touched by flame. The room fell into a hush before Mrs. Grimble leaned forward, her voice low, almost angry. "My wine cellar was broken into," she said, "and not ransacked, just one bottle taken. An 1870 claret. A gift from my husband, who does such a thing." Then Dorothy added, almost hesitantly, that strange markings had been found outside the manor's greenhouse, symbols drawn in chalk, circular and intricate, washed faintly by the last rain but not entirely erased. "All of this," she said, "has happened within the past week on Bellflower Lane." Clara felt the air in the room shift. Suspicion naturally began circling around young Simon, the Langley gardener's restless teenage son, who had once been caught taking coins from the church collection box. But Clara wasn't convinced. "This isn't mischief," she murmured. "It's deliberate." Her eyes narrowed slightly as Dorothy mentioned Mrs. Halbert, the orchid-obsessed widow who kept to herself at the far end of the lane, her house perpetually filled with mist and strange fragrances. "Her nephew Victor arrived last Sunday," she added. "Stern young man, odd habits, keeps to himself. I saw him reading a book on folk poisons at the apothecary." Clara blinked slowly. She had seen Victor too, watching from the shadows near the church's broken gate, his coat too heavy for the weather, his fingers ink-stained and twitchy. Whispers grew louder in the drawing room, fear woven into every word, but Clara's mind was elsewhere, already assembling threads other: the missing heirloom, the injured cat, the wine, the chalk symbols, the strange obsession with orchids. A pattern was forming, not of random crimes but of ritual, a preparation, a build-up. "It's starting," Clara finally whispered, so softly only Dorothy heard her. "And it's not about what's missing, it's about what's coming next." It was just past 6 on a strangely windless summer evening, when Miss Eliza Pembroke received an unsettling call from the parish vicar, his voice low, almost hesitant, as though reluctant to voice what he himself barely understood. Another inexplicable event had occurred on Daffodil Crescent. This time, Mrs. Weatherby's treasured garden ornaments had disappeared. 3 antique brass sundials, and a peculiar Venetian frog clock she'd brought back from her honeymoon nearly 40 years ago. "How utterly preposterous," declared Mrs. Lorimer with a huff, the pearls around her neck trembling as she snapped her fan shut. "Who in their right mind would covet a clock shaped like a frog?" "That Jenkins boy undoubtedly," growled Mrs. Aldershot, her voice tinged with disdain, as she stared out toward the misty hedgerows, as though the name itself could conjure the culprit. But Colonel Stanmore, who had until then been silent, leaned forward, voice lowered. "Mrs. Weatherby mentioned something else," he said. "She saw someone last night, a figure, tall, wearing a hat, perhaps male, lurking around the abandoned Carmichael property near the greenhouse, had a torch. She thought it might be the old caretaker, but something about the way he moved," she said. "It felt too careful, too deliberate." A brief silence fell over the room, broken only by the clinking of teacups and the distant cooing of doves. Miss Weatherby looked visibly shaken, fingers trembling as she reached for her biscuit. "One doesn't like to think," she began, but Miss Aldershot cut in sharply. "What we need is for Inspector Reed to question that Jenkins delinquent properly. Always skulking about with his sketchpad and charcoal pencils. Lord knows what he's drawing." Through all this, Miss Pembroke remained composed, hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes focused not on the others, but on some unseen point in the distance. When she spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "It all feels theatrical," she said, "staged as if someone were curating scenes." Colonel Stanmore blinked. "Theatrical?" "Yes," she continued, her tone calm but charged with some deeper knowing. "The stolen items, a sundial, but not the pedestal it stood on, a clock, but not the base it rested upon, a scarf taken but the purse left behind, a parrot returned with feathers dyed cobalt blue. None of it is random. Each piece is carefully selected, and each omission is intentional. It reminds me of an incident years ago in Oxfordshire, when a girl used props from her uncle's amateur stage troupe to fake hauntings and force a property sale. She used mirrors, shadows, recorded sounds, subtle, artful, deceitful." She paused, letting the silence wrap around her words. No one replied, but the room shifted. Lighter topics were awkwardly introduced, like a lid being placed on a pot about to boil over. The weather, the price of sugar, the prospects for the garden fete. But Miss Pembroke was no longer listening. Later, as she made her solitary way home beneath a sky that had turned from gold to an eerie violet, her thoughts returned to the stolen ornaments and strange sightings. The pattern, the anti-pattern, gnawed at her, and a sense almost primal whispered that what appeared whimsical or harmless was, in truth, a quiet escalation. Reaching her gate, she halted abruptly. There, swaying gently from the lowest branch of her elm tree, was a prism, small, glass, unfamiliar, casting flecks of crimson and gold across her garden wall like fragmented fire. Her throat tightened. It hadn't been there that morning. Someone had been in her garden, watching, leaving signs. Not theft, not mischief. A message. And the play was only just beginning. "Che, families," Miss Lillian Hawthorne murmured to herself, the words slipping from her lips with the quiet venom of long-harbored thoughts, as she stood beneath the weight of the overcast sky, pruning the last of her lavender bushes. The fading light of afternoon filtered through drifting clouds, casting a ghostly pall over the garden beds, where even the roses seemed to listen. Nearby, young Elsie, who had been coiling some rusted garden wire by the shed, paused and tilted her head. "Did you say something, miss?" "Oh, just the wind, dear," Lillian replied with a vague smile, her eyes already straying toward the far corner of her yard, where the creeping vines of honeysuckle gave way to the view of Greystone Lodge, its jagged roofline half sunk in shadow. The house had always looked vaguely watchful, even during brighter seasons, but ever since Clara Drummond inherited it from her late Aunt Lydia Marchmont, whose sudden death inside her orchid conservatory still prickled the nerves of the village, there had been an air about the place, something unspoken and unsettling. Miss Marchmont's passing had been ruled accidental, inhalation of an unidentifiable toxin released from an overheated fertilization process. But even Inspector Riles had seemed uneasy, mentioning how the greenhouse door was locked from the inside, with no sign of forced entry. And yet Clara had moved in within a fortnight, barely mourning, her attention immediately consumed by the same orchids that had killed her aunt. She claimed to be perfecting Lydia's final hybrid, a deep purple specimen with veined petals like blood vessels. The villagers whispered, First about the odd smells drifting from her garden at night, then about the glimmer of lights seen deep in the woods behind the lodge, and most recently, about a scream, shrill and unearthly, that had come from the trees just past midnight 3 nights ago. No one had gone to look, not even the vicar. And so when Reverend Phelps arrived that evening, feigning interest in Lillian's chrysanthemums, she knew something was stirring. "Curious matter at the registry this morning," he said, carefully brushing a dead leaf from his sleeve as he took a seat on her weather-worn bench. "Miss Drummond filed exclusive patent papers on a hybrid she claims to have bred herself. But there's a complication." Lillian's pruning paused. "Let me guess. No official documentation from Lydia Marchmont." "None that we knew of. But Clara says she found a sealed envelope tucked inside a gardening almanac, dated precisely a week before Lydia's death. Instructions, cross-pollination notes, even a name for the hybrid, Lydia's vein." Lillian's eyes narrowed slightly. "How convenient," she said softly, almost theatrical. The vicar exhaled. "It gets stranger. Mr. Keats, the solicitor, says someone contacted him about the intellectual rights before Clara moved into the property. Claimed to be Clara. The call came from Vienna." "Vienna?" Lillian frowned. "But Clara was still in France, wasn't she?" "Exactly. And she insists she never made the call." Silence settled briefly, broken only by the soft rustling of branches overhead. "And now," the vicar added, his voice lower, "there's talk of something else, something unsettling. A child's shoe was found in the woods behind Greystone. Old, muddy, but never reported lost. It's been sent for analysis." Lillian felt a chill wrap around her spine. That evening, at the village shop, while pretending to browse cards, she overheard Mrs. Barnaby speaking in low, urgent tones to Mrs. Elspeth near the licorice jar. "Ted saw her again last night. Clara, in the forest, digging. Said she was whispering to the soil, talking to it, like she expected an answer. Talking to the soil." Elspeth looked pale. What on earth was she saying? Something about bloodlines and regrowth. "And then I have the root, I just need the memory." Elspeth made the sign of the cross. "You don't think it's witchcraft, do you?" But Barnaby didn't answer. She was staring at something behind Miss Hawthorne. Turning slightly, Lillian saw it too. A slip of yellowed parchment, partially wedged beneath a bag of peat moss, soil-stained and torn at the edge. She bent to retrieve it. One glance at the writing made her blood turn cold. In a thin, frantic scrawl, the words read. She took what wasn't hers. "If the orchid blooms, I'll never rest." She mustn't grow what was stolen. She mustn't awaken it. There was no signature, but the scent on the paper, faint, floral, decayed, was unmistakable. It smelled like Lydia's greenhouse. That night, as the wind picked up and the trees groaned against the weight of something unseen, Miss Lillian Hawthorne stood by her window, watching the faint flicker of a lantern swaying behind the curtain at Greystone Lodge. Something had returned, something rooted in secrets, and fed by lies. And now, it was beginning to grow again. The autumn wind stirred the amber leaves along the narrow lanes of Thistlewood, as Miss Eliza Harrow, dressed in her dove-grey coat and lavender scarf, emerged from Weatherby's paper and post with a card embossed with watercolor violets, its scent faintly perfumed with rosewood and nostalgia. As she lingered near the counter, Mrs. Granger, the ever-watchful shopkeeper, expertly wrapped a parcel in brown paper and twine, muttering half to herself, "They're saying the weather will stay fair till Friday, but these old bones never lie, something's brewing." Eliza smiled politely, her voice a gentle breeze. "And the business up on Wren Hollow, any new murmurings?" Mrs. Granger lowered her voice, her eyes glinting. "Plenty. That moon orchid Mr. Finley smuggled back from Sumatra, the kind they say blooms only under blood moonlight. Well, there's talk it's cursed. His niece, Miss Evelyn, is furious about the new will. And then there's Dr. Aldous Vane, always in that greenhouse after dark, poking around where he doesn't belong." Eliza murmured a vague response, but her mind was already tracing the faint outlines of something sinister. As she strolled down the winding hedge-lined lane toward her ivy-draped cottage, Her thoughts turned to a long-ago incident, involving Lady Penworth and her legendary white gardenia, a scandalous affair that had ended in social ruin, though not in death. But this had the scent of something fouler. As she approached her front gate, a flicker of movement across the fence at the Langford estate caught her eye. A shadow slithered through the overgrown garden, hunched low among the orchids and foxgloves. For a moment she thought it was young Evan Langford, the restless and brooding nephew with too much to lose. But the figure straightened, revealing the tall, angular frame of Dr. Vane. He glanced once toward her, then scribbled hurriedly in a small black notebook before slipping into the greenhouse, the door closing behind him with a click that echoed too loud in the still afternoon. Eliza's eyes narrowed, her thoughts swirling with possibilities. The next morning, at precisely 9:46, as Eliza was dusting her sitting room shelves, Clara, her maid, burst into the room, white as chalk. "Miss Eliza, it's Mrs. Langford. They've found her, dead, in the greenhouse. Strangled." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eliza set down a porcelain figurine, her face unreadable. "Who found her?" she asked calmly. "The groundskeeper, Mr. Ellis. Says he arrived early as usual, and saw her lying beneath the orchids. Her face was—" Clara shuddered, unable to continue. Eliza walked to the telephone and dialed the Rawdon estate. Lady Rawdon answered, breathless and agitated. "It's true, Eliza. Isadora Langford has been murdered, and they're saying it was Evan. His boots matched the prints in the soil, and now he's vanished without a trace." Eliza's voice was quiet, deliberate. "Perhaps, or perhaps someone's planted more than flowers in that greenhouse." By early afternoon, the sleepy village of Thistlewood had erupted into a storm of speculation. Outside the grocer's, Mr. Doyle declared, "Mark my words, it's always the ones with the eyes too quiet and the smiles too quick." Near the butcher's, Mrs. Kemp whispered, "That orchid was unnatural, never should have been brought here." As Eliza walked toward the Langford estate to meet Lady Rawdon, she passed groups of villagers clustered in tight circles, voices buzzing with rumor, but she was listening for what wasn't being said. A missing journal, a torn piece of parchment found near the compost heap, a sudden change in the will 2 days before Isadora's death. Lady Rawdon met her at the estate gates, cheeks flushed with nerves. "They're certain it was Evan. Inspector Giles says the evidence is clear." But Eliza paused at the threshold of the greenhouse, her eyes scanning the broken stems, the fallen watering can, the unbloomed orchid trembling as if with memory. "No," she said softly, almost to herself, "this wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of calculation." The glasshouse was more than a sanctuary for rare blooms, it had become a theater of deception, where obsession and inheritance entwined, like strangling vines. And somewhere among the wilting petals and shattered trust, the truth was waiting to be unearthed. The storm had rolled in just after midnight, its rumble echoing through the quiet hills like a warning no one heeded, soaking the earth around Ashcroft Manor's ancient greenhouse, until it was soft enough to capture secrets. And in that yielding soil, a solitary bootprint remained, deep and oddly shaped, a silent betrayal that pointed to none other than Thomas Greaves. The young man had stormed out the previous evening after a bitter exchange with his aunt, Eleanor Ashcroft, and hadn't been seen since. Now, with dawn barely cresting the treetops, whispers of his sudden disappearance slithered through the village like smoke. Eleanor's prized orchid, the legendary moonfire bloom, hailed in hushed corners of the horticultural world as a revolutionary hybrid with both rare beauty and immense commercial value, was found crushed and broken on the greenhouse floor beside her lifeless body, its delicate petals torn, its stem twisted unnaturally, as if nature itself had recoiled from the violence. The short journey to Greystone Lane was punctuated by Lady Aloan Radcliffe's increasingly animated speculations, her gloved hands clutched tightly in her lap, as she reeled through theories of greed, betrayal, and secrets buried in family blood. Upon their arrival at the imposing stone residence of Mrs. Althea Penbrook, Eleanor's long-time friend and fellow botanist, They were met by a constable, whose rigid stance at the gate made it clear the matter had already escalated beyond mere accident. But Alohan's name carried weight in the circles that mattered, and within minutes they were ushered into a drawing room that seemed frozen in time. Dim light filtered through thick curtains, shadows danced among dark wood furniture, and the heavy air pulsed with the scent of orchids long past their bloom. Inspector Calhoun, broad-shouldered and tight-lipped, stood at the center questioning a pale, anxious man who Miss Thorne immediately recognized as Victor Pembroke, Althea's nephew and Eleanor's distant relation, his voice shaky as he spoke of leaving Eleanor shortly before 9, of a heated but insignificant discussion regarding old family assets and breeding documentation. She was fine, he insisted, insistent on finishing her work in the greenhouse as always. A quiet cough interrupted him. A slender woman seated near the window, Livia Gray, Eleanor's assistant and housekeeper, spoke in a tremor-laced voice. She'd been working on something new, something secret. She wouldn't even let me in the greenhouse after dusk. Said there were too many interested parties. Calhoun turned to her sharply. You mean competitors? Livia hesitated. She didn't say, but she did receive a strange letter 3 days ago. No return address. Miss Thorne leaned forward, calm but focused. Inspector, were her research records intact? Calhoun's face tightened. No, the drawer where she kept her hybrid logs had been forced open. The Moonfire's documentation, its breeding cycle, genetic composition, application drafts for international patent, all gone. Victor's face turned ashen. She wouldn't give those to anyone. Not unless someone took them. Miss Thorne finished quietly. Inspector, were her spectacles found? Yes, he said slowly. On the potting bench. Not broken, folded neatly. Odd place to leave them, she murmured. And the twine she used for stem support. Sliced, not frayed, with a fine blade. Then this wasn't panic, Miss Thorne concluded. It was preparation. Someone who knew the greenhouse layout, knew her routine, knew what they were after. Alan gasped. You don't mean murder for a flower? Not just any flower, Miss Thorne replied. A genetic breakthrough. The Moonfire bloom could change entire cultivation markets. Patent rights alone could be worth millions. The room fell silent. Outside the storm retreated, leaving behind a stillness that pressed in from every corner. Thomas Greaves may have run, Miss Thorne said softly, but he may not be the only one with something to hide. The orchid wasn't just a plant, it was a crown. And someone was willing to kill for it. Inspector Harrow's face darkened with restrained irritation as Miss Ellery stood her ground beside the rose trellis, her calm gaze never faltering. We'll be the judge of that, Miss Ellery, he said coldly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we've a manhunt to conduct. As she and Lady Bellingford stepped aside, a breathless constable came stumbling up the gravel path, mud on his boots and panic in his eyes. Sir, word just came in. Nathaniel Crane's been sighted, heading west from Broad Hollow, towards the abandoned granary near Weaver's Lane. Harrow's demeanor changed instantly, barking orders to mobilize a search party as the police scrambled into action. Amid the growing chaos, Miss Ellery and Lady Bellingford returned silently to their car, the engine humming faintly as the scene behind them blurred in the rearview mirror. What do you make of all this, Clarisse? Lady Bellingford asked, her voice low, hesitant. Miss Ellery adjusted her gloves, her eyes distant. I find it curious, deeply curious, that the journal containing Lady Hawthorne's latest horticultural experiments has vanished, and that the murder weapon, a pruning knife, was used with surgical precision. Hours later, Miss Ellery sat in her ivy-clad sitting room, the shadows of the fading day creeping across her floor. From her window she could just make out the flashing lanterns of constables moving about the greenhouse ruins at Hawthorne Estate. She thought of the oddly folded spectacles placed so deliberately beside the victim's favorite planter, of the cut twine so cleanly severed it could not have been an accident, and the strange smudges on the cold frame glass fingerprints perhaps wiped too late. Meanwhile, across the village, Nathaniel Crane, missing since the night of the murder, was apprehended not in flight, but while attempting to steal a packet of stale ginger biscuits from the back of Mrs. Kitt's bakery. He surrendered wordlessly, his eyes gaunt, his hands trembling, and made no attempt to defend himself. The news reached Miss Ellery from her housekeeper Alma, who burst into the study as she arranged foxglove and bell heather in a narrow vase. They caught him, Miss Nathaniel Crane. At Mrs. Kitt's, bold as brass, stealing biscuits of all things. Miss Ellery froze mid-placement. How banal, risking arrest for something so small, she murmured, half to herself. Alma whispered. Jacob says he's been hiding in the old bell tower ruins since the night of the murder. Looks half dead. Poor boy, Miss Ellery whispered back, almost absently, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. Or perhaps desperate. Later that morning she strolled to the local constabulary, her manner perfectly unhurried. Constable Reeve, she said. I believe I may have dropped my handkerchief yesterday near the Weaver's Lane turn, coincidentally near where your suspect was found. Has anything of the sort been handed in? The constable blinked, flustered. No, Miss Ellery, but I'll make a note. She offered a gracious smile. So kind. Might I inquire after young Nathaniel? I've known his family for years. Quite a shock, all this. The constable hesitated, but nodded slightly. He's being questioned now about Lady Hawthorne's death. Inspector Harrow's with him. Just then, the back door opened and the inspector himself stepped out, his jaw tight. Miss Ellery, I really must ask, why are you always a step behind my suspects? Or a step ahead, perhaps, she said lightly. Tell me, has Nathaniel confessed? Harrow sighed, exasperated. He admits to the thefts, says they were childish pranks. But he denies knowing anything about the murder, claims he never even went near the greenhouse that night. Miss Ellery tilted her head. How convenient. And yet, the journal is missing, the knife is missing, and the only living soul who knew of Lady Hawthorne's hybrid orchid project is now very dead. She turned gracefully to leave, adding over her shoulder. And yet I suspect the truth lies not in what Nathaniel admits, but in what someone else has taken great pains to bury beneath a garden of lies. Murder, what a chillingly curious affair, Miss Eliza Harrow mused, as she drew her gloves tighter and stepped across the dew-damp cobblestones, leading to the ivy-draped Bromley estate, where the formidable and secretive Mrs. Agatha Thornwell had been discovered lifeless amid the shattered remnants of rare orchids in her locked conservatory. The village buzzed with scandal and suspicion, with young Edward Blythe, a lanky boy with a history of petty theft, and an unfortunate knack for being in the wrong place, already branded the killer in hushed whispers and sharp glares. Yet to Miss Harrow, a woman of quiet observation and piercing memory, the pieces didn't quite fit together. Everything felt too calculated, too neat, like a stage play with the curtain drawn too soon. Inspector, might I have a word with the boy? She inquired gently, her voice almost lost beneath the fluttering of the yellow police tape. This is not a garden party, snapped Inspector Corwin, visibly irate, but before he could protest further, Constable Linley spoke up with a nervous cough. Sir, we still haven't taken Mrs. Downing's full account. Perhaps you could do that while she's here. Corwin hesitated, scowled, and finally relented with a grunt. 5 minutes, and she's not to be left alone with him. Inside the holding cell, Edward sat hunched, his knees pulled up on the cold metal bench, eyes hollow from fear and confusion. When he saw Miss Harrow, something in his tense expression softened recognition, perhaps a flicker of hope. You don't think I killed her, do you? He whispered. Miss Harrow offered a warm but unreadable smile, and held out a wrapped cloth parcel, which Linley dutifully inspected before handing it over. Shortbread, she said simply. Stolen or not, a boy needs to eat. Edward's fingers shook as he took a piece, crumbs tumbling from his lips as he spoke. Everyone thinks I did it because of the other things. I did take stuff, silly things. The weather vane from the chapel roof, silver spoons from Mrs. Greaves, and yes, that painted owl from the vicarage. But I swear, I never meant harm. I was going to return them. It was just a game, a prank. Miss Harrow nodded slowly, her eyes studying him like a chessboard. Like when you replaced the hymn numbers with winning lottery digits. His eyes widened. You remember that? That was years ago. I remember a great many things, Edward. But tell me, why did you run away the night Mrs. Thornwell died? He hesitated, chewing his lip. I went to her conservatory. I was going to take one of those orchids, just one. But someone was already in there. I saw the light of a torch moving inside. I got scared, thought it might be the police because of the other stuff, so I ran. Did you recognize the figure? No, just the torchlight. Too dark. And the time. It had to be just past 9. The church bells had stopped ringing. When Miss Harrow returned to her small cottage that evening, she lit a single lamp and sat down at her writing desk, her mind churning as she began a meticulous list. Silver spoons, but no forks. A brass candlestick, but its pair untouched. A garden statue returned oddly repainted. The pattern was theatrical, almost comical, not the work of a killer, but of someone trying to appear like a petty thief. She remembered the Farnsworth boy, a long-ago scandal, where small, silly thefts had masked a deeper embezzlement scheme by a family member who needed the village distracted. A diversion, she murmured. But from what? Then it struck her. Miss Thornwell's prized orchid hybrid, rumored to be worth a small fortune in patent royalties, was conspicuously absent from the crime scene. She scribbled a new entry, hybrid orchid, missing. And then another thought followed, sharp and cutting. Miss Ellery, the solicitor, had been asking peculiar questions lately about intellectual property tied to horticulture, and hadn't Mrs. Thornwell's estranged nephew recently returned, furious over her refusal to fund his investment schemes, not to mention Dr. Tavers, the botanist with a too eager fascination for the conservatory's contents, whose alibi for that night was, at best, convenient. The more she pieced it together, the clearer the shape of the truth became. Not a boy's careless crime, but a calculated act of greed, buried beneath a pile of childish mischief. Just then, the telephone shrilled, breaking her concentration. "Eliza, darling," came the breathless voice of Lady Fenwick. "You must hear this. Agatha's entire account was drained the morning before her death." Miss Harrow's eyes sparkled behind her spectacles, and she allowed herself the faintest smile. "Yes," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the pen. "I rather thought it might be." When the accusation of stealing Mrs. Fortescue's brooch was pinned on Reggie Cobb, a storm of gossip swept through the village. Yet, in Inspector Slack's eyes, the kind of certainty that usually accompanies the scent of a killer was missing, particularly because the boot print, a crucial piece of evidence, didn't quite match Reggie's shoes. The most puzzling part was Reggie's repeated claim on the very night Mrs. Hawksworth was murdered, he had seen someone else sneaking out from the greenhouse, hidden in the shadows. Miss Marple, who had an uncanny ability to discern truth from falsehood in the subtlest of remarks, simply offered a faint smile and said, "How very interesting." I was beginning to feel the same. After a brief but telling conversation with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple opened her handwritten notebook and scribbled another note, precisely cut garden twine. A quiet feud brewing within the local gardening society, and a secret buried within that silence, unsettling and dark. Those petty thefts, silver spoons, an old brooch, a costly candle stand, were merely a distraction, a deliberate misdirection hiding a much more sinister game. In Miss Marple's mind, a tangled web was slowly beginning to clear, where the thefts were mere pawns, and the real game was being played over something far more dangerous, a secret valuable enough to kill for. In the warmth of a May morning, Miss Marple put on her second-best tweed suit, paired it with a slightly outdated hat that had nonetheless remained loyally part of her identity, and with a small bouquet of freshly picked flowers from her garden, she made her way to the quiet stretch of Larkspur Lane, now steeped in unease, as if every resident had become a silent participant in the growing mystery. When she arrived outside the Hawksworth bungalow, the constable standing by the gate, whom she had previously seen in the company of Mrs. Bantry, recognized her and said, with a touch of regret, "Ma'am, the family isn't receiving visitors at the moment." Miss Marple replied gently, her tone shaded with quiet sadness, "That's a shame. I only came to offer my condolences. and thought I might take one last look at Mrs. Hawkesworth's garden. We used to have such long, delightful conversations about our plants. This is a little tribute in her memory." The constable hesitated, torn between the rigidity of duty and the softness of decency, but finally gave in and said, "All right, ma'am. Mr. Hawkesworth is out visiting his solicitor, and Miss Brewster is resting. You may leave the flowers. The garden is currently unoccupied." Miss Marple nodded in gratitude, opened the gate, and stepped into a garden that had once been alive with joy and beauty, but was now haunted by tragedy. She observed it closely: perfectly trimmed hedges, meticulously arranged flower beds, a modest rose garden that still faintly perfumed the air, and far off in the corner, the large greenhouse where Mrs. Hawkesworth's body had been found, now cordoned off with police tape. As Miss Marple gently placed her bouquet beneath the rhododendrons, a sudden voice startled her. "Beautiful specimens." Mrs. Hawkesworth had exquisite taste. She turned and saw Mr. Preston standing a few steps behind her, a tall, lean man with eyes that held a flicker of unrest, though his face wore the mask of mourning. "Mr. Preston, isn't it?" Miss Marple asked politely. "I hear you're quite the gardening enthusiast yourself." "Indeed," he replied. "We met frequently at the Horticultural Society, though my own interest leans more towards tropical specimens." In her usual innocent tone, Miss Marple inquired, "I'd heard Mrs. Hawkesworth was working on some orchid hybridization project. Something quite special, wasn't it?" A shadow flickered across Preston's face, as though trying to hide something beneath an invisible veil. She was very private about her research, as she had every right to be. There were commercial implications involved. "Commercial implications?" Miss Marple repeated, feigning mild surprise. "Yes," Preston said, his gaze drifting toward the greenhouse. "Patent rights, potential royalties. If a new hybrid succeeds, it brings both recognition and profit. Word was she planned to unveil it at the Society's next annual meeting." Miss Marple was about to respond when a sharp voice rang out from inside the house, cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Constable, I told you no one is to be allowed in." Mr. Gerald Hawkesworth, who until then had remained unseen behind the curtains, came storming into the garden, his expression furious and barely restrained. In that moment, the familiar knot twisted again in Miss Marple's mind. This garden, where every plant was perfectly placed, every bed neatly shaped, where tranquility should have reigned. And yet, something was screaming beneath the silence, a truth buried not just in soil but in secrets. And Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew the scent of rosemary in spring, that she would have to dig it up, whether it lay behind a polite smile, or hidden in the sorrow behind someone's eyes. Striding across the lawn with thunder etched into every line of his face, the man approached, tall, sharp-featured, likely in his mid-30s, dressed in clothing that screamed affluence yet worn with the careless indifference of someone who considered such matters beneath him. His features might once have been handsome, were they not hardened by a permanent scowl of discontent. "Mr. Hawkesworth," Miss Marple said gently, stepping slightly aside in deference, "I do apologize for the intrusion. I only wished to leave a small bouquet in memory of your late aunt. Mr. Preston and I were merely discussing her extraordinary legacy in horticulture." Gerald Hawkesworth's hand cut the air dismissively. "Yes, yes, my aunt's precious plants. That's all this village seems to care about, as if a handful of flowers were worth mourning." He trailed off mid-sentence, his gaze narrowing on Preston. "I wasn't aware you two were acquainted." "We've only just met," Preston replied smoothly, his tone warm but guarded. "I came to pay my respects, as did Miss Marple. Your aunt's work was deeply respected in botanical circles." "So I've been told," Gerald muttered with thinly veiled irritation. "Endlessly." His words clipped and his voice turned cold. "I appreciate the sentiment, but we're quite preoccupied with funeral arrangements and legal matters, if you'll excuse me." "Of course," murmured Miss Marple with a sympathetic nod. "Such a trying time. I don't suppose there's been any word on the missing documents, the ones related to her new orchid hybrid." Gerald froze mid-turn, surprise flashing in his eyes. "How do you know about that?" "Village gossip, I'm afraid," Miss Marple offered with a faintly apologetic smile. One hears things, and the police did mention some files were unaccounted for when Mrs. Bantry and I visited earlier. The police should learn to keep their mouths shut, Gerald snapped. But no, nothing's been found. Not that it matters. Her obsession with those plants was utterly baffling to me. Without another word, he spun on his heel and stormed back toward the house. Preston raised a brow. Not exactly a lover of gardens, is he? No, Miss Marple agreed, watching Gerald's retreating figure. I rather suspect there was tension over the resources she devoted to her plants. Preston nodded thoughtfully. It happens. One person's passion is another's extravagance. He glanced at his watch. I should be going. It was a pleasure, Miss Marple. Left alone, Miss Marple wandered deeper into the garden, appearing to admire the landscaping but keenly observing every detail. Once she was confident no one was watching, she approached the greenhouse. Though the police tape kept her out, she could peer through the glass. Inside, the central workbench, where Mrs. Hawksworth's body had presumably been discovered, was now bare, but the surrounding shelves remained cluttered with orchids in various stages of cultivation. Her eyes drifted to a shelf at the rear, where several labeled pots stood conspicuously empty, strange gaps amid an otherwise dense collection. As she turned to leave, Miss Marple paused by a small table set on the veranda, its surface scattered with gardening magazines. The topmost journal caught her attention, multiple pages marked with slips of paper. A quick glance toward the house assured her of privacy. She opened the magazine to one of the marked sections, an article on the legal protection of orchid hybrids. One paragraph was heavily underlined. Registration of new orchid hybrids with the Royal Horticultural Society secures naming rights, while patents protect commercial propagation. Rare hybrids can fetch over £500 per specimen, making successful hybridization a financially significant endeavor. Miss Marple replaced the journal precisely as she had found it, and quietly made her way to the gate, offering a polite nod to the constable on duty. As she walked home through the quiet lanes, her mind whirred with connections, the heir's contempt for his aunt's life's work, the rare plants missing from the greenhouse, the marked article on the financial value of hybrid orchids, and Preston's curiously detailed interest. These were not unrelated threads. They formed the early outlines of something far more calculated. The break-ins along Lark's Lane, she suspected, were no random mischief, they were a diversion. Someone had wanted access to that greenhouse. Someone who understood both the value of what lay within, and how to shift suspicion elsewhere. And just as she reached the corner where the lane joined the high street, her eyes caught a notice pinned to a shop window, an upcoming rare plant auction hosted by the County Horticultural Society. A faint smile touched her lips, things she suspected were just beginning to bloom. Among the many postings on the local Horticultural Society's notice board lists of rare seeds, upcoming flower festivals, and volunteer calls for botanical tours. One particular entry halted Miss Marple's eyes in mid-scan. Selection of specialty orchid breeders. Private exhibition and registration, 5 days hence. Her eyes didn't just linger, they locked onto it, and a familiar tightening formed in her chest, a sign her mind had begun quietly connecting threads. This wasn't just about a passion for plants. No, someone had killed, not in a fit of rage or for revenge, but for something more insidious, for the claim of an extraordinary creation, the sole right to a hybrid so unique it could elevate its owner's name into scientific journals and fortune. In the fiercely competitive world of botanical hybridization, time wasn't merely a factor, it was the battleground. The first to register claimed the legacy, the fame, and the profit. The very next afternoon, in the comforting hush of her garden room, as light rain glazed the windows like a lullaby of secrets, Miss Marple entertained Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock for tea. Inside, the fire crackled, and Cherry had excelled herself with scones that still steamed, their buttery aroma mingling with the scent of rosehip tea. The conversation drifted, as it inevitably would, to the recent tragedy on Lark Lane. "I saw young Reggie Cobb this morning," Dr. Haydock remarked, lowering his voice as if the rain might overhear. "His mother brought him for a checkup. He looked absolutely depleted. The poor boy's crumbling." "I'm not surprised," Miss Marple said calmly, pouring tea, her voice like the slow ripple of water. To be under suspicion of murder, especially at that age, must feel like being buried alive in whispers and stares. Still, Mrs. Bantry chimed in, he admitted to all those strange thefts, didn't he? Miss Marple's knitting paused for a beat. Yes, but don't they strike you as almost performative? Like someone wanting to be noticed doing something foolish, to draw attention, but perhaps away from something else entirely. She resumed knitting, needles clicking like distant thunder. It reminds me, Dolly, of a case from years ago, the summer Edward Bedders vanished. Remember the church fund? He was treasurer, and during those months, small oddities occurred. The vicar's cat died, green hymn numbers replaced by race results, even gnomes in indecorous arrangements. Dr. Haydock leaned forward, brows raised. Diversions. Precisely, said Miss Marple. Everyone blamed the village prankster, but it was Bedders himself, using spectacle to obscure his embezzlement, nearly £200. And when the truth surfaced, he was long gone to South America. Mrs. Bantry looked rattled. So you think something similar is happening? It's possible. The thefts on Lark Lane. Why a sugar bowl but not its teapot? A single brooch, painted garden ornaments, even a dyed cat. These don't suggest desperation. They suggest a script, written to confuse, to cast shadows over something far more dangerous. She placed her knitting down, her eyes now fixed and sharp. And what greater motive than the sole ownership of a breakthrough orchid? Mrs. Hawksworth was days away from registering a hybrid that could redefine her career. Just then, a brisk knock sounded, and Cherry appeared, announcing Inspector Slack. He entered with his usual stiff manner, radiating irritation like static. Miss Marple, he said flatly, I've been told you've been poking around the greenhouse. I only paid my respects, she replied mildly, and left a few of my own flowers. Would you care for tea? Slack waved it off. I'm here because your instincts about Reggie Cobb might not be entirely off base. The boot print doesn't match his shoes. Clothes, but the heel pattern differs. Someone may have staged that print to mislead us. Fascinating, Miss Marple murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. And the orchid documents, the registration forms and hybrid records. The inspector stiffened, his expression sharpening like a blade drawn halfway. How did you know about those? Miss Marple gave a serene smile, but her thoughts were already racing. Someone had killed not out of madness, but strategy. And the killer, she now believed, was still watching, waiting for their name to be etched in botanical history, no matter the cost in blood. The air was damp with the lingering scent of rain, and a faint chill crept through the evening, as Miss Eliza Harroway stood by her window, gazing thoughtfully at the distant silhouette of Hawksmoor Manor, the grand yet somber estate where, just days ago, the lifeless body of Lady Beatrice Harroway had been discovered in her greenhouse, a length of garden twine pulled tight around her throat. The village was still reeling from the shock, but Eliza, an old hand at quietly observing what others missed, suspected this murder was not simply about inheritance or envy. Something far more intricate, more calculated was at play. She had already pointed out to Inspector Hale that Lady Beatrice's prized orchid research notes had vanished after the murder, a detail he had brushed aside with a tight expression. Those papers were important, Eliza remarked in a steady tone, especially now that I've learned how valuable new orchid hybrids can be on the open market. The inspector, clearly annoyed but restrained, replied, We're investigating several possibilities, Miss Harroway. But I must ask you to leave the policing to us. He secured a reluctant promise from her not to return to Hawksmoor Manor, at least for now. Once he departed, Dr. Lennox, who had been listening with growing intrigue, turned toward Eliza with a faint smile. You seem to have a theory, he prompted. Eliza's knitting needles resumed their rhythmic clicking, her gaze fixed not on her yarn but on something far more elusive. Only a suspicion, she murmured. But I believe Lady Beatrice was killed because of her orchid work. The missing documents likely included her hybridization notes, and perhaps more importantly, the registration papers for the Royal Botanical Registry. Mrs. Alcott, seated nearby, leaned in with surprise. Registration, you mean for a patent? Eliza nodded. Precisely. For a new hybrid to be formally recognized and patented, it must be registered, and there's an auction this weekend at the County Botanical Fair. If someone stole her work and claimed it as their own, they stand to make a fortune. Dr. Lennox folded his arms, brow furrowed. And with Lady Beatrice dead, there'd be no one to contest their claim. Exactly, Eliza replied, setting down her knitting and reaching for a notepad. Now who might possess both the knowledge and access? Mr. Alden Preston comes to mind. He's supposedly an expert in tropical flora, yet I've seen him lingering in the orchid section far too often. Then there's Gerald, her nephew, the heir to her estate, though he seems indifferent to horticulture. Miss Breen, the live-in companion, had unrestricted access to the house and greenhouses. And of course Hopkins, the gardener, who practically lived among those plants. She looked to Dr. Lennox. Would you be so kind as to drive me to the county society tomorrow? I want to inquire about their registration procedures. That evening, once the rain had subsided, and the village returned to its usual rhythm, Eliza made her way to the church hall, where the annual flower show had drawn a crowd. Whispers of the Hawksmoor case floated between the displays of dahlias and roses, but Eliza's focus was drawn to a far corner where an array of exotic plants were displayed, and where Mr. Preston, with a pencil in hand and a small leather-bound notebook, was meticulously inspecting each specimen. His movements were exact, almost surgical, and the care with which he touched each plant suggested both reverence and deep expertise. When he caught Eliza observing him, he approached with a practiced smile. "Miss Harroway," he said cordially, "are you participating in the exhibition today?" "Oh no," she replied with modest cheer. "My little blooms could never hold their own against these." Then with a subtle edge, she added, "You seem rather knowledgeable yourself, Mr. Preston." "A lifelong passion," he replied, brushing a speck of dust from a leaf. Though Lady Beatrice was the true authority, such a loss, especially with her hybrid so close to registration. Eliza's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "You knew about the registration?" A fleeting flicker crossed Preston's face, hesitation, perhaps regret, or something darker, but he quickly regained composure. "Only vaguely. She mentioned it at the last society meeting." She was excited, though characteristically secretive about the details. "If you'll excuse me, I must greet the vicar." As he walked away, Eliza's eyes followed his retreating figure, her mind sharpening with suspicion. His movements were so precise, so deliberate, much like the work of someone who would know how to tie a length of twine just tightly enough, just cleanly enough, to kill. The county archive was quiet under the grey hush of morning light, the silence broken only by the occasional shuffle of paper, or the low hum of a ceiling fan. Miss Evelyn Thornfield stepped through the arched oak doors with purposeful grace, her burgundy wool coat buttoned neatly, a soft scarf tucked at her collar, and a felt cloche hat perched with deliberate elegance, an outfit that whispered tradition, but eyes that hinted at keen observation. Her presence drew a fleeting glance from the archivist behind the desk, a man named Mr. Linley, who looked up with a polite nod. "Miss Thornfield," he greeted. "Not often we see you here during the week." "Ev," then returned a genteel smile. "A peculiar interest has taken root, Mr. Linley, orchid cultivation, and the legalities surrounding plant hybrid rights." That raised his brow, but he said nothing, simply guiding her toward the reference room. Within minutes, Evelyn sat at a polished reading table, surrounded by slender field guides and dense legal tomes, one notably titled Floral Fortunes, Ownership and Protection in Botanical Innovation. She turned the pages slowly, not in haste or panic, but with deliberate strokes underlining key passages and filling pages in her leather-bound notebook. The process for registering a botanical hybrid was more stringent than she'd imagined. Clear evidence of lineage, dated progress logs, witness verification, and most notably, proof of the breeder's identity at the time of submission. Even a whisper of that documentation falling into the wrong hands could spell the difference between obscurity and millions. One clause in particular caught her attention. If a specimen was submitted under fraudulent identity, but with original unregistered data, the fraudster could still be awarded provisional naming rights, pending challenge. "Most compelling," she murmured. After thanking Mr. Linley, Evelyn made her way to the Rosehill Cafe to meet her confidant Dr. Felix Ashcroft, a botanist and friend of her late Aunt Clara, whose death a fortnight ago had been attributed to natural causes, though Evelyn was no longer convinced. Over warm tea and cautious glances, she relayed what she'd found, including a curious discrepancy in Clara's private research journal. The final entry mentioned a midnight visitor, and an upcoming registration at the Danesfield Horticultural Exhibition. Someone knew she was on the brink of a breakthrough, Evelyn said, voice low, and I suspect they silenced her before she could present it. Felix's expression darkened. You think someone murdered her for the rights to her orchid? Not just murdered her, Evelyn replied. They've stolen her entire work and plan to present it as their own, this Saturday, when the committee convenes. By late afternoon, they arrived at the County Horticultural Society headquarters, a stately Georgian manor repurposed into offices and galleries, where a sign on the lawn read 3 days, until the Rare Bloom Gala. Inside, a receptionist with sharp features but warm eyes looked up. How may I assist you? Evelyn softened her tone. My late Aunt Clara Harrow was preparing to register a new orchid hybrid. I'm simply trying to understand what that process involved. At the mention of Clara's name, the woman's demeanor shifted. Oh yes, such a loss. She was rather secretive, but very passionate. She was due to present her documentation and specimen this weekend. Quite the stir among our members. Some say her hybrid had the potential to change commercial breeding entirely. Evelyn leaned in. Would her documents have been submitted before her death? Not yet, the receptionist replied. They're reviewed live during the presentation. Until then, everything remains with the breeder. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Whoever had stolen those documents likely intended to pass them off as their own at the gala, under full ceremony and applause. She stepped back into the crisp evening, the wind lifting her scarf, her mind racing. Somewhere in that society, perhaps among the presenters, or even the committee, was a murderer hiding behind botany and protocol. And Evelyn Thornfield, with her notebook of clues and a quiet storm of resolve, intended to expose them before a single petal unfurled on stage. The conservatory of the Royal Botanic Society was a cathedral of controlled chaos. Sunlight filtered through etched glass panes, falling on rows of rare orchids that shimmered with unnatural colors, while beneath their delicate petals, a storm of secrets brewed. Miss Eliza Harwood, serene in appearance but razor-sharp beneath her soft-spoken manner, leaned subtly toward the receptionist, who, after a furtive glance in either direction, lowered her voice and confessed with barely concealed tension that a certain Mr. Langford, brilliant, volatile, and infamously territorial about his hybrid experiments, had been in open conflict with Professor Whitcomb before the latter's tragic and suspicious death, a conflict that escalated when Whitcomb publicly unveiled a hybrid orchid bearing uncanny resemblance to one Langford had claimed was still in trial phase. They nearly came to blows at the last symposium, she whispered, her eyes darting to the empty corridor. Armed with this nugget of rivalry, Miss Harwood gracefully rejoined Dr. Lennox, who had been silently inspecting a case of preserved botanical cross-sections, his hands folded behind his back and his demeanor unusually taut. Did you find something useful? He asked, as they exited the marble halls. Indeed, she replied, her eyes distant, voice even. More than I expected, an entire garden of motives, you might say. Back in Greystone Hollow, as twilight cloaked the ivy-covered cottages in velvet gloom, a message awaited her. Mrs. Templeton had called with breathless urgency. Eliza returned the call at once and was met with a torrent of revelation. Clara, the late professor's longtime housekeeper, had stumbled upon a folded schematic wedged deep within one of his oldest horticultural journals. A garden plan unlike any other, marked with codes, initials and peculiar red underlines circling specific orchid beds within the greenhouse. Notations Clara couldn't comprehend, but instinctively knew held weight. He guarded that greenhouse more fiercely than his own study, Mrs. Templeton added gravely, and Clara says he once told her that what bloomed inside could change everything. Realizing the magnitude of what lay beneath those coded notes, Eliza urged her friend to bring the document post-haste. That night, Under the steady hum of her reading lamp, she penned 3 decisive letters, the first summoning Inspector Braithwaite to her cottage on the pretext of a breakthrough in the Whitcomb case, the second to Dr. Lennox requesting his botanical insight over tea, and the third, crafted with the delicacy of a scalpel, to Mr. Langford, suggesting a private discussion regarding a matter of hybrid integrity and intellectual ownership. Later, just as the church bell tolled 9, her maid Lottie slipped in breathless with news gleaned from her fiancé at the police post. An internal inventory had revealed that several of Whitcomb's most unique orchids had vanished from the supposedly sealed greenhouse, each one catalogued under restricted access and irreplaceable value. Now gone without a trace. Inspector Braithwaite's been storming up and down the station, Lottie murmured, says someone must have had a second key, or a damn clever hand. Eliza paused, her knitting undisturbed, and said softly, so it begins. The theft was not about profit. It was about erasure. After Lottie had gone to bed, Eliza placed a quiet call to an old friend at the Royal Patent Archives in London, inquiring about a series of orchid-related pharmaceutical filings tied to the names W.L. and E.H. The voice on the other end confirmed what she had begun to suspect, and as she replaced the receiver, a faint smile curved her lips, a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. Alone in the lamplight, surrounded by rose-scented silence and the rhythmic click of her needles, she let her mind knit a pattern far more intricate than any wool. There was the vanishing of the experimental orchids, the violent precision of the greenhouse wire cuts, the cryptic codes in the garden plan, the deliberate framing of Martin Fenn, a troubled apprentice with a criminal past and just enough motive to appear guilty, and the bitter feud between Whitcomb and Langford over uncredited breakthroughs that could revolutionize botanical medicine, each piece now locking into place like a trapdoor springing open. As her eyes narrowed, the fog that had obscured the killer's identity lifted, revealing not only who had orchestrated the murder, but why, a motive not of passion, but of legacy, greed, and a desperate need to uproot a truth that had finally begun to bloom. Mrs. Bantry entered the room clutching a folded paper, one Miss Marple, instantly recognized as the late Mrs. Hawkesworth's meticulously drawn garden plan, the one she'd always guarded with such peculiar secrecy. "Jane, I sincerely hope you know what you're doing," Mrs. Bantry whispered anxiously, glancing toward the front door. "Inspector Craythorne sounded absolutely livid when I spoke to him, said something about interference." "I'm sure he did," Miss Marple replied calmly, her expression unreadable, "but I believe what we uncover this afternoon may prove far more enlightening than he expects." Within minutes Dr. Lennox Hayward arrived, his brow furrowed with concern, followed closely by Reverend Giles, who looked utterly puzzled as to why a parish vicar was summoned to a gathering that radiated such tension. Then came Gerald Hawkesworth, prompt to the second, his stiff demeanor suggesting he saw this as a dreadful inconvenience. Inspector Craythorne soon followed, visibly annoyed, and flanked by a silent uniformed officer, who took position by the doorway with military precision. "Miss Marple, I do trust we're not wasting official resources on idle chatter," the inspector began curtly, declining the offered tea with a wave. "We're knee-deep in a homicide, and time is not our ally." "As are we all, Inspector," Miss Marple said with serene politeness. "Ah, and here is our final guest." All eyes turned as Mr. Preston stepped inside, pausing for a heartbeat as he surveyed the small assembly before giving a guarded nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "this is more of a tribunal than the horticultural discussion I expected." "Do sit, Mr. Preston." Miss Marple gestured toward an armchair. "Some tea." As she presided over the teapot like a quiet monarch, her voice remained calm, but carried the weight of something decisive. "I thought it prudent we examine some overlooked aspects of Mrs. Hawkesworth's demise. Not an investigation, of course, just observations, drawn from years of paying attention to the peculiar rhythms of village life." She sipped her tea, then continued. "You may recall the rash of small thefts on Wren Lane, a brooch here, a candlestick there, quite reminiscent of a case from my youth, where a bank clerk staged petty distractions to mask a far larger embezzlement scheme." Gerald shifted uncomfortably. What relevance does this have to my aunt's murder? Quite a bit, Miss Marple said, setting her teacup aside. The thefts weren't random. They were deliberate misdirections, designed to establish young Toby Crane as a troublemaker, painting him as the perfect scapegoat for something more valuable. But this wasn't about heirlooms or silver. This was about something cultivated, something delicate, and potentially very profitable. The orchid hybrid, Dr. Hayward said under his breath. Exactly. Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Hawksworth had bred a unique orchid variety, a hybrid she intended to register at next week's Horticultural Congress. Its commercial value was no secret to those in the know. During my research at the County Horticultural Society, I uncovered records indicating she'd already submitted preliminary paperwork, just enough to prove her intent, but not enough to prevent someone else from seizing the credit posthumously. You've no right to involve yourself in police matters, Craythorne snapped, but she was undeterred. The killer required two things: the original plants and the corresponding documentation. With Mrs. Hawksworth gone, and those items in hand, they could register the hybrid as their own creation. A small crime masked by petty mischief. Dolly, may I? Miss Marple took the folded paper from Mrs. Bantry and smoothed it on the table. Here, positions 7 through 10 on the third shelf, see the coded markings. Those are the very orchids reported missing yesterday. Gerald leaned in, his voice low and incredulous. You mean to say someone murdered my aunt, for a flower, for the ownership of an exclusive biological creation, which over time could be worth tens of thousands, she corrected. Mr. Preston gave a tight smile. A gripping hypothesis, but surely speculative. Not entirely, Miss Marple replied. I telephoned the Royal Horticultural Society yesterday. They confirmed that Mrs. Hawksworth had indeed submitted an early claim for a new hybrid, a safeguard before next week's unveiling. But with the formal presentation undone by her untimely death, anyone in possession of the right materials could swoop in, claim authorship, and reap the rewards. So yes, Inspector, it may seem like garden gossip, but what we're truly dealing with is botanical theft turned fatal. A faint but telling shift flickered across Dr. Lennox's face, barely perceptible to the untrained eye. Yet Miss Eliza Wren noticed it at once, a subtle narrowing of the eyes, a rigid stillness creeping into his shoulders. Moreover, she continued with calm authority, I believe Mrs. Ellingham realized her prized conservatory had been infiltrated, quietly, repeatedly, and always with purpose. She likely stumbled upon someone inspecting her experimental hybrids, perhaps even copying the meticulous notes she kept hidden in her coded garden ledger, notes that could unlock horticultural acclaim if claimed by another. I imagine she confronted the trespasser, and that confrontation turned fatal. A skeptical snort escaped Julian Ellingham's lips. And who exactly is this elusive thief of blossoms and glory? Miss Wren turned her gaze deliberately toward the local constable. The evidence, if one dares to see it clearly, is quite damning. The twine used to strangle Mrs. Ellingham had been cut with slow, precise strokes, exactly the kind of action one might expect from an expert in plant grafting, not the frantic work of a flustered young apprentice like Thomas Bay. Her spectacles were found neatly positioned on the potting shelf, a silent testimony that she had been working focused when interrupted. Most damning of all, several of her rarest orchid hybrids are now missing. Orchids whose descriptions, encoded but unmistakable, appear in her private research files. She turned back to Dr. Lennox, her voice cool but edged. It rather reminds me of the incident with Miss Appleton's dressmaker, who attempted to pass off another's pattern as her own. When exposed, she acted with startling violence to protect the illusion. This is preposterous, muttered Dr. Lennox, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. I barely knew her. That's simply not true, Miss Wren replied evenly. You served on the Orchid Breeders' Circle board together. In fact, I've spoken with the registrar, who recalled a rather sharp disagreement between you both at the last meeting. Mrs. Ellingham had announced a revolutionary cross-pollination method. You objected, not just publicly, but passionately. It's all circumstantial, he said. But color had drained from his cheeks. Perhaps, she said gently. But I suspect a swift search of your glasshouse would uncover not only the missing orchids, but also the leather-bound notebook Mrs. Ellingham never let out of her sight, and possibly even a pair of boots custom-ordered to match the ones young Thomas wears, meant to implicate him by mimicry. The room went still as thunder, the silence pressing in like fog. Then suddenly, Lennox bolted upright, but Constable Drew had already anticipated him, and blocked the doorway without a word. "You have nothing," Lennox snapped, his voice now cracked and brittle. "No real proof." "Oh, I think we will," said Constable Drew, stepping forward with new conviction. "Orchid pollen, soil traces, boot prints, murder leaves its signature, even among the petals." That evening, long after the doctor had been taken away and the guests had trickled back into the quiet shadows of their homes, Miss Wren sat in her modest garden, hands still as she gazed at the moonlit foxglove swaying after the storm. She thought of Mrs. Ellingham, of how one woman's love for delicate blooms had ignited envy in another heart, of how the pursuit of beauty could drive someone to destroy it. She sighed softly, wondering not for the first time why something so lovely as an orchid could provoke such darkness. But then again, she mused, human nature was a strange vine, twisting the same in vast cities or secluded villages. Jealousy, ambition, pride, they rooted themselves in any soil, masked beneath politeness and propriety, until suddenly, horrifically, they blossomed. "The Willowmere Whisperer," she murmured, the nickname the press would no doubt bestow upon the tragedy. She smiled faintly, more weary than amused. In the end, it wasn't the missing orchids or even the notebook that condemned Dr. Lennox, but the arrogance of precision. Had he ripped the twine hastily, like a man caught in a panic, suspicion may never have touched him. But his obsession with clean, methodical work, the very skill he took pride in, became his undoing. As night deepened and stars emerged like silent witnesses overhead, Miss Wren rose to tend to her dahlias, reminded once more that despite the darkness she often uncovered, there was still solace in simple things, in kindness, in truth, and in the flowers that bloomed on no one's timetable but nature's own.